All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled, What are the Best Practices for Tele-Rehabilitation for Children with Disabilities? Ethical Considerations, Evidence, and Coaching Families for Success, with Chantel Camden, Dahlia Carey, and Deborah Teitelbaum. My name is Allison Bewald, and I'm an engagement specialist here at the Physiotherapy Association. I will be your moderator today. New to our webinars moving forward is that registrants will be able to join the webinar for free using their device. But if you call by phone, you will be responsible for any applicable long-distance fees. Please check with your long-distance provider. Before we get started, I'd like to do a brief tour of the webinar room. First, if you scroll to the bottom of your screen, you'll notice that in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a microphone with an audio setting drop-down list. If you're having difficulty hearing, kindly adjust your audio settings using this icon and ensure that your device's audio settings are on and you are using the appropriate speaker setting. You can also test your speakers to set best volume audio quality. If you have a question that you'd like to ask the speakers, please use a Q&A file pod at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side of the icons. Don't wait until the end of the session to submit your questions, as we may have many moments throughout our discussion, and we'll deal with most questions at the end. If you have any personal insights or informal comments on the material that you'd like to share with the group, please type them into the chat box. Simply type in your question and press enter. Finally, we will be posting today's recording of the webinar on the CPA website, and everyone will receive free access to today's recording. This way, you're free to participate and enjoy the session today, and you can revisit the sections that you'd like to take further notes on at your leisure. Now I'd like to do a little introduction of all of our speakers today. Professor Dahlia Carey is a physiotherapist by training, associate professor at the École de Réadaptation Physiotherapy program at the Université de Montréal, and research at the Center of Interdisciplinary Research in Rehabilitation. Her research program focuses on the development, evaluation, and implementation of innovations in rehabilitation, including telerehabilitation. Chantel is an associate professor at the School of Rehabilitation at Sherbrooke University. Her research focuses on developing, implementing, and evaluating evidence-based interventions and service delivery models for children with developmental delays or disabilities. She is involved using multimodal web-based services to develop Tier 1 services. Deborah Teitelbaum is a physiotherapist originally from Montreal and received her MSc in Rehabilitation Medicine from McGill University. She moved to Calgary 24 years ago and works at the Alberta Children's Hospital and Early Childhood Rehabilitation Program at the Child Development Center. She provides ambulatory rehab services for children with neurodevelopment issues. I now want to turn this presentation over to Dahlia, Chantel, and Deborah. Take it away.
So thank you, Allison. Thank you very much to the Canadian Physiotherapy Association and the Pediatric Division for inviting me today to talk to you about rehabilitation. I want to mention that a lot of what I'll be talking about today comes from my research and my clinical experience, as well as that of the research team that I collaborate closely with that's on this screen, that's been involved in telerehabilitation since 2003. So today, my objectives are to first define telerehabilitation so that we all have a common understanding of what we're discussing today, and a bit later talk to you about important clinical considerations that arise when considering telerehabilitation. I just want to double check. I see that there are some comments popping up in the chat. Is my slideshow visible to everyone?
Looks good on our end, and volume's great too.
Okay, thank you. Oops. Okay, so let me begin by presenting a few basic concepts that we need to understand telerehabilitation. A common value that we share across Canada is the need to ensure that healthcare services are accessible to all those who need them. What that concretely means is ensuring that there are no obstacles to receiving the necessary care. So even prior to the onset of the current COVID-19 pandemic, strategies to improve accessibility to healthcare services were already being explored. We know we need to do things differently, and with the onset of the current crisis and the subsequent need to drastically limit physical proximity, the need to ensure accessibility to care has become even more pressing and has forced us in a way to think differently. And it has really been a turning point. We've realized that we need to think of ways of providing quality care even when we cannot be in close proximity with our patients. So what is telerehabilitation? Since the start of the pandemic, there has been a growing interest in telehealth activities in general, and more specifically what we're going to be talking about today, telerehabilitation. There are various terms and definitions that are used in the literature to refer to telerehabilitation, and I don't want to take time today to go through all of those. But I think that if we agree on a common definition for what we're talking about today, that is important. So this is from the American Telemedicine Association, that the delivery of telerehabilitation is the delivery of rehabilitation services using information and communication technologies. Usually those technologies refer to technologies using the internet, although the phone can also be included in this. So what do we mean by rehabilitation services? So yes, these include assessment and treatment with patients, which is what we most often think of, but they also include monitoring, follow-ups, training of health professionals, education of patients and caregivers, for example, consultations for an expert opinion, meetings for care plans, and so on. Telerehabilitation includes activities that can take place between a physiotherapist and a patient, with or without a caregiver, between two physiotherapists with a patient, so for example, for a specialized consultation, or with another health professional, such as a PT assistant, for example, or a specialized educator. And the telerehabilitations can take place between a clinical setting and a patient at home. And at the moment, we're talking a lot about a clinician at home and a patient at home. Between a patient in a different location, in a community setting, perhaps in a school setting in pediatrics, or in another healthcare center, such as a regional rehabilitation center where they might be transferred to. And why do we do telerehabilitation with patients? It could be for assessments, reassessments, to prepare for a discharge to the home or to another setting, or it could be to provide education regarding posture, for example, or an exercise program, or to provide support or coaching in some cases, as we're going to see later on. And there are two basic types of telerehabilitations that we talk about in the literature and in practice: synchronous and asynchronous. Synchronous happens when the patient and physiotherapist are communicating together in real time, or two clinicians are communicating together in real time. So it could be over a video conference application, for example, and it usually involves at least audio and video communication. Whereas asynchronous involves collecting data that is then transmitted to the other person, who can access it at a different time and can act on it at a later time. So for example, sending a video of an exercise program to a patient, or some photos, or receiving photos from a patient, and you follow up on it at a later time, is an example of asynchronous telerehabilitation. So the term telerehabilitation includes both of these. For asynchronous, it includes email and messaging, for example. So I'll pass it on now to my colleague, Professor Chantal Camden, to talk about the evidence for telerehabilitation in pediatrics.
So hi everyone, I'm just setting it up. So you now should see my screen. And we'll get started with the evidence for telerehabilitation with children with disabilities. So I first declare that I have no interest to declare, otherwise accepted perhaps, that obviously the way that we are going to look together today at the evidence is really based on my own experience in research with telerehabilitation. So when we talk about evidence, often we think about evidence-based practice. And I'm sure you all have seen this before, that evidence-based practice is grounded in scientific evidence, clinical experience, and patient preference. So today what we're going to do is really to look first at the scientific evidence, and then looking at experience, which is mostly, again, grounded in my own experience with telehealth in research. We won't discuss explicitly patient preference, but I would argue that in current times, as mentioned by Dalia, there's really huge questions around feasibility that will probably drive our decision to choose or not to do telehealth. So with regards to scientific evidence, what I want to share with you today is really the results of a literature review we conducted and finally published just a few months ago, which is available online if you have access to a university library. And otherwise, we are hoping probably by next week to put the post-print online so you can freely access the paper. But let's review like the main results that we found in the literature review. So first, it's really important to understand the context in which we did the review, which was before the COVID. So we were really interested to really look at the evidence that we have for Tele-Rehabilitation with children, and really to inform actually how to design effective intervention with children. So because we were looking at evidence, we looked at randomized controlled trials only, so really high quality evidence. We, however, decided to go really broad, so not only looking in the PT field, but all rehabilitation professionals that were delivering any kind of at-distance rehabilitation intervention to children aged 0 to 12 years old. We found lots of articles, but only 23 that actually met the criteria. So, and most of them were published after 2016. So really the evidence, the scientific evidence that we have for Tele-Rehabilitation with children are just emerging. And I'm pretty sure that in the next couple of years, we'll see tons of new evidence to support the use of Tele-Rehabilitation with children. Now, there's a great diversity of population and characteristics of the tele-intervention that were tested, and we'll have a look into this. So in autism, I would say that's clearly the population of children for which we have more evidence that it really works. But in a nutshell, really what you need to do is that even if we have few high quality scientific evidence, we do have evidence that suggests that Tele-Rehabilitation is effective in general for children with disabilities. We, however, do not have that many high quality studies looking at the effectiveness for children with motor difficulties. We have a few for cerebral palsy and traumatic brain injury, suggesting evidence so that Tele-Rehabilitation is effective for these children. And we have a couple of articles with different other population, like children with developmental coordination disorder, for instance, sometimes not necessarily randomized controlled trials, so they were not included in our review, but yet there's pre and post design, for instance, that will suggest that Tele-Rehabilitation is effective. When we looked at the tele-intervention characteristics, we found lots of diverse intervention, just as Dalia was explaining. So some actually, so phone calls were included using forums, for instance, to provide information, so asynchronous intervention, some synchronous intervention like video conferencing or interacting with the parent, for instance, to coach the family. What we did not see that much was actually, and this is more seen perhaps in adults, it's the figure at the right, so actually intervention where you actually deliver an intervention directly to a child. So most of the interventions were actually directed towards the family. In terms of treatment goals, there were a wide variety of intervention objectives, and all these categories of objective, we do have evidence that you can actually achieve these treatment goals through Tele-Rehabilitation. So changing children's behavior was probably the most common, but also parents' behavior, so really related to interacting with the child, but also some more parents-related outcomes. So for instance, decreasing anxiety. Decreasing the severity of symptoms, improving communication, but also improving functional abilities and motor skills. But again, motor skills was probably the outcome that was the least studied, even if we do have some evidence that Tele-Rehabilitation could work to improve motor skills. Now, the second question that we had was really more specifically looking at what are the characteristics of the intervention that seems to work. So currently, it's really to be interpreted with caution because again, the evidence is just emerging in pediatrics, but we have more evidence for behavioral objectives. So it seems to be easier thus far, or at least this is what we have studied more when we want to change children's behaviors or parents' behavior using telehealth. It seems to work best when we actually, the intervention is designed to be centered on the families or the parents as opposed to interacting directly on the child, which probably makes sense somehow because they are children. When there is a specific program to follow, so when there's really clear guidelines with regards to what the parents is expected to do or what the families are expected to do online. Coaching, and I know actually Deborah will come back to that. So when there's a coaching approach that is used, it seems to be much more effective than just providing information. So again, I'm sure we'll have more details about what coaching is in a few minutes. With regards to dosage, so to create this relationship online, it's really important you have some continuity of services or some frequency. So at least once a week for over 8 weeks seems to work best. But again, it is to be interpreted with caution because it certainly depends on the previous relationship you have with the family and also the treatment goals, obviously. And the last one is also to be interpreted with great caution, because we found that when a psychologist was involved, it seems to be associated with greater effectiveness. But again, because there's lots of very good quality studies done in autism, lots centered on changing behaviors, it doesn't mean that you need to have a psychologist involved, but the current state of the literature suggests that we have more evidence for intervention where a psychologist is involved. And in a nutshell, actually, if we want to summarize the evidence that we have for Tele-Rehabilitation, I would suggest that we should not ask the question, is Tele-Rehabilitation effective for children with disabilities, but really rather look at trying to better understand for whom. So can we do all kind of family, children with different kind of conditions, treat them online? For what kind of objectives? So we know that there's broad categories that we are able to actually deliver services online. It seems effective. And I'm saying online, but I should say distance, again, including, for instance, phone calls. And under what circumstances? So really to better understand how it works and how we are able with time to increase the effectiveness of the intervention that we do deliver at distance. Now, if we move to the second part, which is more related to a reflection, perhaps, on our own experience, there's probably things that are best to do face-to-face and other things that are best to do online, and there's probably things that can be done either way. What I would argue, though, is that with the current crisis, probably that there's things that we would have done normally face-to-face that now we do online. And it's really about feasibility, just because face-to-face is not currently possible. I would also argue, because we have been discussing like what we would put in the different sections in the different boxes, and there was actually lots of things that perhaps we would have traditionally done face-to-face, and we think it's not feasible to do online because it requires equipment or hands-on, or because of security reasons. And it's true that we cannot do it exactly the same way online, but there's perhaps ways to achieve a similar or the same objective, but working differently. For instance, using a coaching approach and working more closely, for instance, with the families. So again, this is grounded in our own experience, which has ranged from using online modules and then community of practices, and then starting to develop platforms, so multi-model platforms, and refine it with stakeholders, clinicians, families. And we are currently running a trial, which is called We Care. So it stands for Web-Based Early Intervention for Children using multimodal rehabilitation. So we hope to be able to contribute to increase the quality of the evidence that we have in the future, with a specific focus on children with motor difficulties. And in summary, what I think is really important is for you to be able to create personalized relationships with the families, very specific and personalized objectives, so really targeted to the families you're working with, and adjust your services accordingly. It's also very important to have timely response to families' needs. So obviously it ranges according to seasons in Canada, but also with the day-to-day experiences, practices, and perhaps frustrations also. So this idea of timing is really very important. And I think this is probably something actually that's a big plus with Tele-Rehabilitation, because it's so accessible. Again, thinking about information, which is probably not enough, so we want to use a coaching approach, but yet information is important for family. And using this coaching approach grounded in problem solving collaboratively with families, and thinking about using a variety of technology modalities. So not only thinking internet synchronous, but again, lots of different options, and providing the support to families so they can use it. And to conclude, I just wanted to leave you with this acronym. So I was trying to reflect about what do we know and what do we need to think about when we do Tele-Rehabilitation with children and with families. And think about viewing. So what can you observe? And observation is really key, and especially with synchronous video conferencing. But it could also be through video. So we have families, for instance, using their phone to record a child trying to learn to cycle or to perform different activities, and sending by emails or by platforms the child trying to perform an activity. And so we can actually interact with the family. So observation is really something that you want to use with Tele-Rehabilitation. Information, again, so using web pages to provide information, sending information by emails, but really thinking about what does the family need now? What will actually help these families. Relationships, just as for face-to-face, relationships are really important online, and thinking about using those relationships to build capacity and to be a coach to really work collaboratively, again, with the family. And T stands for technology. So obviously thinking about you being ready to use the technology and to use it correctly to be able to also support the family and to best deliver your interventions. Unique, so just remember that all families are unique in terms of their ability to use technology, but also in terms of their needs and context. So same thing as face-to-face, this idea to be able to respond to families' needs again. And access, so Danielle already mentioned that technology was seen and still seen as a way to increase access to rehabilitation services, but just keep in mind that virtual services might or might not always be accessible for all. So we think about families who might not have access to high-speed internet, for instance, for different reasons. The kind of intervention that we deliver through virtual services might not be the best for these families. So just keep in mind and make sure that everyone actually has access to Tele-Rehabilitation services, and think creatively about how to reach those families who might have more limited access. And L for legal, so just don't forget also legal aspects, including confidentiality. So that's all for my presentation for now. Just want to say thank you to my team, the funders, and I'll be looking forward to hear from you with regards to your questions and comments at the end of the presentation. And I'm now going to turn to Deborah for the next presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you.
We can hear you, yeah, sorry.
Great. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak about coaching families in my clinical practice. I use the same coaching model, be it during face-to-face intervention or virtual tele-rehab, with some minor modifications. Looking back over the past 30 years, I have changed the way that I conduct my treatment sessions significantly. Originally, I was much more didactic and directive, and now I provide more of a guiding presence. Originally, I find patients are more satisfied and seem to be more competent. I find families have become more effective in supporting and handling their children. Coaching meets their goals, it follows their agenda, and is guided by their expertise on their child and my expertise on movement and development. Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulty. Can you hold on 1 second?
Deborah, if you click on your screen, and then it will allow you to move forward.
Okay, thank you. So historically, coaching has been associated with sports, sporting achievement, and the self-help industry. Coaching studies in healthcare, and specifically in pediatric rehab, are becoming more prevalent according to a systematic review in 2019 by Ogrtsova, O'Donnell, and Mainemer. However, according to Ward et al. In 2019, another systematic review, there is continued lack of clearly defined clinical actions. Neurodevelopmental therapists working in pediatrics generally teach parents how to handle and support their child in order to reach their gross motor goals. Traditionally, we impart knowledge through instruction, explanation, and demonstration, which tends to be directive. However, coaching is not just telling or instructing. If you find yourself doing a lot of telling, it isn't coaching. How does this impact us as therapists? On the one hand, we are experts in the field of development and movement, so we are motivated to instruct. On the other, the literature is providing evidence supporting learner-driven intervention, non-expert, non-directive models. Why is this? For good reason. I think they work, and I find families feel empowered and more confident. Coaching refocuses expert-driven intervention to learner-driven intervention. The driver of the intervention shifts from the healthcare professional to the client. And in my case, the client is the child and the caregiver. I treat children between the ages of birth to 5 years old. So what are the main elements of coaching? Coaching is goal-directed and planned jointly within a shared partnership between coach and coachee, therapist and client. This is different from traditional rehab sessions where they are often planned by the professional and goals are generated by the rehab professional. When coached, the learning happens through active participation of the client to a large degree, but there's still an element of instruction and demonstration by the therapist. Coaching techniques include, but are not limited to, problem-solving tasks, experiential learning, and trial and error. Reflective questioning and probing questions are used to help the learners think about how they did, how it worked, and what they can do to improve. Improvement feedback with permission supplements their self-assessment. Coaching has a strong element of commitment to a planned action by the client. So, what does this look like? What are the specific actions a therapist does when coaching? The outlining theories and principles, as you can see here on the outside, in this model, influenced my practice. My applied coaching model integrates these clinical theories and principles with instructional theory, the blue circles, Gagne and Briggs, for example, one of the first to describe instructional theories, and coaching strategies, the blue and green circles, and applies action to each element. These actions lead to improved performance, as you can see in the middle here. These learning events are laid out in a circle starting at engage and continue clockwise. One can move from one step or any step to any other as required. What's important is that all the components are present within your sessions as a whole, but don't need to be present in each individual session. I will explain all the learning events. Engage. An important component of the coaching process is creating the therapeutic alliance. I call this step engage. Engagement runs throughout my sessions. This is a space to make a family feel welcome and comfortable. I demonstrate curiosity by actively listening and using simple reflections. I specifically ask about their child's strengths and personality. I do this because families are often asked about their child's weaknesses or lack of abilities. Families appreciate when they are offered a moment to tell a personal story about their child. I highlight the caregiver's role as expert in their child and describe our relationship as a shared partnership. If this is a follow-up session, I always ask about the previous goal in home practice. This checks recall of prior learning and checks readiness to progress and caregiver capacity. It creates flow and connection to the previous session and a reminder of our joint plan. In addition, I always ask about specific concerns and for their focus for the day. This gives power to the client. In really listening to the answer, you will know what motivates them to be there and changes the focus from expert-driven to learner-driven. The coaching process relies on meaningful goal setting by the family. It creates the motivational driver for the process. To do this, I explore the big picture with the family, sit with them with their hopes exposed, actively listen and reflect back what the family says. This helps families know that you understand them and that you are striving towards the best possible outcome for their child. I call it negotiate the goal because as an expert, you guide them to convert their long-term dreams into short-term goals. I find families are often overwhelmed and really appreciate having a concrete plan and roadmap. Then together, we write a SMART goal. Giving control to the family to drive the session is powerful and makes families more engaged in the process. There is an element of instruction in coaching. I show them how to do an activity. That might involve how to hold and support their child. When they feel comfortable, I encourage them to try it themselves. I normalize the learning process by using phrases like, it takes time to learn something new. While demonstrating, I like to clearly and simply narrate either before, after, or sometimes during the activity so the caregiver can observe what I'm doing. I consciously slow down. Sometimes families will say, well, it looks easy when you do it, but I can't. The magic is often in the setup. These are things we take for granted, but make all the difference when you And when you point them out to families through reflective questioning, then they can get it. Where might be a good place for you to sit when you are doing this activity? That might be an example of a reflective question. Open-ended questions or reflective questions as well are more powerful than closed questions in that they help me understand what the family gets and what they are missing. More importantly, open-ended questions makes the caregiver think about the details of the activity. An example of a question I may ask is, how did I support your child during this transition? Rather than, did you see how I supported your child? Practice by the learner is a significant component of coaching and the use of reflective questioning to enhance a learner's self-awareness. According to Dunstan Trivet 2012, practice is actually twice as powerful as using instruction and demonstration alone. We learn by doing. Coaching ain't telling. So in this stage of the model, we concentrate on providing multiple opportunities for the learner to imitate or practice the activities. I ask if there is a portion they feel comfortable practicing today with my help. I affirm their dedication and effort. I often mention to them that it takes deep and deliberate practice to get better at something. I tell them to be gentle with themselves and that I'm here to coach them along the way. Reflective type questions such as, what felt right while you were practicing, or what didn't work so well, consolidates their learning by getting them to problem solve and learn how to apply solutions to future situations, and makes them realize that they know the answers and are capable of practicing the activities at home. As a coach, I accept what works for the family and always interact in a non-judgmental way. I am their guide, not their driver. Have you heard the saying, if you are working harder than the client, you are working too hard? At this stage, I review the SMART goal with the family and ask them to summarize the activities that we practice together. In doing this, families link together how the activities support the goal. This cements their motivation to practice activities. This is a time to pay attention to a caregiver's nonverbal communication, as they may be signaling that expectations need to be adjusted. I help families identify barriers to practice and how they might resolve them. Develop a plan for them, with them, for how, when, and where the practice will occur. I always ask the family how they would like to record the activities, photos, videos, written format. Sometimes I suggest caregivers write the activities down themselves. Often I say, help me remember. Once a colleague told me that one of our joint families told her that Deborah doesn't have a good memory. She always asks me to help her remember the activities. I remind families to stay humble while practicing, that people always make mistakes before they can improve. If you could pick one takeaway from today, from my little talk about coaching, what would it be? Telling ain't coaching. Coaching is goal-directed by the family. We learn by doing. Coaching uses reflective questions. Active participation is more powerful than instruction. Ask family for their focus for the day. Actively listen to families' concerns. And coaching has a large component about committing to action. We learned from Camden et al. 2019 that tele-rehab may be more effective when coaching approaches are used, especially when related to parent skills. I was very happy to hear this. I've used a coach approach to support families in problem solving their developmental issues via Zoom during these unprecedented times. Sorry, let's just go back. Whoops, can't go back. Back here. Sorry, I'll just talk to you about Tele-Rehab. I've used a coach approach to support families in problem solving their developmental issues via Zoom during these unprecedented times. The feedback from families have been only positive. They seem to really appreciate the connection to their healthcare provider and the convenience. I think telehealth forces me to be a better coach. Because I'm not there in person, it encourages more opportunity for the family to practice. It allows me to see the setup, their toys, as well as the other children in their home. This makes it easier for me to discuss possible obstacles and identify opportunities to practice using probing or reflective questions. Sometimes the older children start demonstrating, which is an added advantage. It forces me to slow down and be more observant. Even before the pandemic of ECR, we have been using asynchronous telerehab. That's where families have sent us emails, videos, postures, feet, equipment, and we get back to them by telephone. When caregivers send emails of their children and therapists respond by email at a later time, this is another way that we have used asynchronous telerehab. I wanted to give you, and I hope I will be able to find the way to do it, this is not an exhaustive reference list, but a list of authors who have influenced my clinical coaching practice over the years. I highly recommend reading some of these authors and their research to more deeply understand learner-focused interventions. Thank you very much. Now I'll pass it over back to Dahlia.
So thank you very much, Deborah, for the great examples. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about things that should be considered when you're choosing to use telerehabilitation and some of the ethical considerations that you need to keep in mind. So specific things that you need to remember about is obviously it doesn't allow for the assessment or the teaching that will require hands-on. But that doesn't mean, as you've seen today, that there aren't ways of compensating for this, but you need to be aware of it. You have to also remember that you can only see what the camera sees. So that if there's another person with you in the room when you are doing this, the patient needs to know that, and vice versa. So for example, if you have someone with you for tech support, or you have someone from your family around you, and the patient cannot see them, they need to know that and they need to consent to that. You have to also remember that there could be delays in the audio. So you need to wait for responses. It also doesn't allow for several people to speak at the same time. So for example, if you're thinking of doing some group interventions during this time with everyone separate, it's important to keep that in mind. It's important because you want to ensure that you're providing quality care as much as possible at all times. So even though we have the evidence for some of these interventions, we want to make sure that we're always providing quality care. And you will likely have to think of alternatives to some of the hands-on assessments or treatments that you do, as they've been mentioned. So make sure to come prepared, have the tools that you may need at close proximity, and be creative. Given some of the changes that telerehabilitation brings about in clinical practice, there are some ethical issues that should be taken into consideration, and some of these were mentioned a little bit briefly before. So because telerehabilitation is not the usual form of intervention, you need to obtain informed consent from the participant, at least at the first visit. What that means is that the physiotherapist needs to ensure that the patient or the parent, in some cases, understands what they are consenting to. And this should be noted in the file. There is discussion about whether it should be a written or verbal consent, and the provinces differ regarding this, so please check locally. It's also important to take into account patient privacy and confidentiality. So by making sure the patient is aware of who can see them, who can hear them, and by carefully choosing a secure platform and ensuring the patient of any privacy risks when you obtain consent. The general recommendation had always been to do the initial assessment in person, but with the current COVID crisis, it is generally accepted that the first session can be by telerehabilitation as long as the required information is able to be gathered, so that it remains up to the physiotherapist to decide if the first visit can or cannot be done using telerehabilitation. It is also very important to have the contact information for your patient, an emergency number, and so on handy in case of anything. This is especially true if there's no caregiver present, although it may be less frequent in pediatrics. The physiotherapy notes that are kept should be complete as you would do in clinic, and they should indicate that the session was conducted using telerehabilitation. Always remember safety first and use your clinical judgment to decide if you feel telerehabilitation is appropriate or not, depending on the situation, or whether or not you can modify an exercise safely, for example. There really is no one-size-fits-all rule in this case. It's important also to remember that in cases when using telerehabilitation with a patient in their home, you are in their personal environment. And with clinicians in their home, they're in your personal environment as well. So please keep that in mind. And lastly, an important consideration is to remember that if you will be involving the caregiver differently than what you would have done had you seen the patient in person, be aware of caregiver burden that this might be causing and whether this is acceptable to them or appropriate or not. Lastly, I'd like to remind you, stay up to date. The regulations at the moment are changing quickly. So check the Canadian Physiotherapy Association website, check your local organization's websites. They've developed really fantastic resources in a very short time. I've put here one that we have from the Order of Physiotherapists in Quebec and the web page at the CPA addressing telerehabilitation with lots of the resources that are offered. So I'd like to thank you for your attention today, and I'm going to pass it over to Allison for the question period. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to Dahlia, Chantel, and Deborah for that content. It was great. We got a lot of engagement, and we're going to go through the Q&A now. And you guys can answer as you see. So we actually have one that was laid out first for Chantel. When you talked about using a variety of technology to provide telerehabilitation, could you give some specific examples?
Yeah, sure. And I already responded to the comment in the chat box too. But just to say that in most of the studies we found actually do use multiple examples of technology. So Dalia discussed about the different types, synchronous and asynchronous, for instance. So I gave the example that in some cases, for instance, they were like a very structured program. Sometimes it was for parents to read through an online module, for instance. Sometimes it was more like an exercise program to do with the child. But in most of the cases, there were actually also a therapist calling the family every week to monitor progress and know how it was going and respond to families' questions. So this is this combination of different type, if you want, of tele-intervention that we often see within one tele-rehabilitation program, if you want, or intervention. In our case, for instance, we also use in a multi-model intervention, emails, well, not emails, so it's integrated within a platform, so a more secure environment, but something like emails, forums, so to recreate this kind of group discussion that we can have also face-to-face, but asynchronous, so where we have parents and therapists interacting together. We also have video conferencing, and we have some online resources too. So this is this idea to combine and think about like using different type of technology or strategies to actually deliver the services online, depending on your goals, obviously. So I don't know if it responds to the question.
I believe so. That's great. Thank you so much, Chantel. Katie here asks, in terms of record keeping, does anyone record sessions or what are your thoughts on recording sessions? Also, what do you typically do with video provided by caregivers?
I was just waiting, Delia, if you wanted to respond, because it's related also to confidentiality and legal issues and so on. Again, personally, so we are using it within a research context, so it's a little bit perhaps different. So what we do again is that we have our own platform that we developed for the intervention that we are developing. We do sometimes record sessions, and parents are aware when we do record the sessions, and as are the therapists, but we use it mostly for fidelity reason. So just for checking how the intervention is being implemented. And in terms of keeping, so we have discussions with our therapists implementing, so PTs and OTs implementing the Tele-Rehabilitation intervention. So what we have decided is not to record the sessions for them as personal professional notes, if you want, for different reasons. We believe it's probably better, safer, more cost-effective in terms of time management, just for them to take just normal notes as they would do in face-to-face and have like their dossier. What they will do though is if they ask parents, for instance, to record a video of their child performing an activity, then they are instructed to upload the video sent by the family on our platform again, which is a secured platform. So obviously just be careful not to leave it on your computer if it's, and especially if it's a shared computer, for instance, at home. So it's all this kind of aspect, legal confidentiality aspects. And Dalia, I don't know if you want to perhaps add on this.
Yeah, so I think you've addressed it well, and there is a difference of when telerehabilitation is done in a research context versus a clinical context. Generally, sessions are not recorded and in a clinical context, and that's one of the factors that will also affect whether a certain application is considered secure to be used for healthcare applications. So if it is recorded, where is it stored, etc. So I'd recommend if you feel that you need to be recording it, that you speak even to your professional order or perhaps at the CPA to see if there are certain applications that are safer than others to use. And that's also changing very quickly.
Thank you so much, both of you, for that one. Next question here, Sarah asks, what is the best practice in regards to recording keeping when photos and or videos are used to aid PT assessment, treatment, consultation? Should the video become part of the health record, or is it a detailed chart note about video sufficient?
Deborah, have you had any experience with that? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I was just going to speak to that. What we've done is, so our emails, of course, are confidential. They have not been put into SCM or anything like that, which is our charting system at the hospital. We do just chart on the chart on that we had discussed the email with the family by telephone.
Great, thank you for that, Deborah. Now we have a question here from Janice. Many mentioned having families send in videos of their children. How are you ensuring this information remains confidential? How are you storing these videos in the client record?
At our hospital, we are not storing the emails.
And I guess, as I mentioned too, because I was the one talking about like sharing videos, so we store it on a platform, which is really highly secured and only accessible to our staff. within the team. So I think it really depends also on the regulations in your work setting, the professional order in your province too. So there's probably different rules. So honestly, we have found that sometimes it's really helpful to have access to a video recording. Now, do you need to keep it or not? This is a different question, perhaps in some clinical setting, like Deborah was mentioning. So if you're not allowed to keep any files, so emails or video recording, it doesn't mean that you cannot use it to see the child in a different context. But again, I suspect it probably really varies from one context to the other.
One of the things that we do actually is something called video coaching at the hospital. And what the family does is they come in without their child and bring on their telephone just videos of their child. And so we're not actually keeping any of the videos in that way. And we just talk about the video. The family goes home with the video. We don't have it.
Maybe I can just add one comment. It's not specific to the videos, but I think it's important to consider that when you're doing it by telerehabilitation or you're treating in person, you want to kind of think of things in kind of in the same way. What would you do with a video that you would get from someone, or if you took a video of a patient there, would you be taking a video, and why do you need that? So I think the same clinical reasoning has to happen for you to decide whether you need that and whether you need to keep it or not. Allison, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you for answering that, all of you. We have another question here. You mentioned Zoom. Is it FIPA compliant?
So I think the question is it HIPAA compliant?
HIPAA, sorry.
No, it's okay. It says FIPA, but it's HIPAA. That's whether it has met certain standards for safety and security. And I'm not going to get into it here because that's also changing very quickly for all the different applications. Right now, there are certain versions of Zoom that are considered acceptable for health interventions. And I think that may differ also from province to province, and maybe also for from healthcare setting to another, or clientele to another.
Perfect. Thank you, Dahlia. This one's directly for Deborah from Maria. Maria asks, can you provide more information on your process for helping parents to be comfortable and compliant with home exercises and to overcome barriers?
Could you read that one more time? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you provide more information on your process for helping parents to be comfortable and compliant with home exercises and to overcome barriers?
Yeah, well, basically it comes down to setting the right goals with the family. And if that goal is actually coming from the family and it's really meaningful and it's something that they're motivated to do, then it probably follows that they will be wanting to do those activities. And that's why it's so key, I think, to continuously connect the activities that you're teaching to the goals that they've set with you initially. So if they can see that there's a connection there, because sometimes our activities are so, they're such short-term goals and they can't relate to their long-term goal. But if you can continuously connect those two, they can see that those activities are actually leading towards their goal. Then that makes it really motivating, and they want to do it. Does that answer your question? There's a second part to that question. Allison?
Let me just get it back. Sorry, I said it was answered process. Can you provide can you provide more information on your process for helping parents to be comfortable and compliant with home exercises and to overcome barriers?
So I often have a conversation about, you know, when, how, why, where are they going to actually do those activities? And so when you flesh out all of the answers to those questions, it helps parents figure out the logistics of doing those activities. As well, one of the things that I like to do is talk about the child's routine, their daily routine with the family. And sometimes I like to pair some of those activities with those daily routine habits. So if, for example, we're really trying to, we're working on, say, sitting up independently, and we want to get stronger abs, and we're really doing some strengthening activities like little baby sit-ups, we'll pair that with a time that the family thinks is reasonable. And sometimes what comes up is when they change the baby's diaper, then at that time on the change table, they can just do little baby sit-ups 5 times in a row every time they change the baby's diaper. So we'd like to pair it with the routine to make it easily remembered. Does that make sense?
Yes, I believe so. We'll see if there's a response after to that, but it looks like all is good on that end. I think we have time for just a couple more questions here. What are some resources you recommend to learn more about effective coaching?
Oh yeah, I did answer in the little chat here. I feel that Rush and Sheldon's coaching handbook might be a really good place to start. It has great ideas on reflective questions or probing questions. It really gives you some good ideas of the practical application of doing reflective questioning.
Awesome, thank you. And we'll just end on this question here. Natalie says, thank you very much to all. Do you know if there is a Telehab service for repositioning class, head shape, example, plagiocephaly, sorry, I might be butchering that word, prevention and evaluation at ACH or elsewhere?
Sorry, I didn't hear. What was the exact thing that she wanted to know about in terms of plagiocephaly and head shape?
Prevention and evaluation at
yes.
ACH or elsewhere.
Yeah, so there is a head shape clinic at the Children's Hospital. There's also, you can self-refer to the head shape positioning classes. So that's where a physiotherapist will have a look at the child and help with positioning, as well as some little activities, and also decide whether or not it is recommended to go to the head shape clinic.
Deborah, are those provided by Telehealth? Or do you know of any that are?
I don't think they were in the past. I know that because of the pandemic, we are all rushing to get to being able to provide more services by Zoom or Skype for Business. And so perhaps after the pandemic is over, we will be more in a position to start, or we'll be becoming much more comfortable with tele-rehab, and perhaps it will go online or more of a telehealth focus.
Fantastic. Well, I think we'll wrap that up for today. It was very engaging. We had a lot of people come in, over 200 people came in, lots of great questions, fantastic comments. So I just want to take these final moments on behalf of CPA to thank you, Deborah, Chantel, and Dahlia, for all the work you did on this and the great content provided. We really appreciate it. And hopefully we can have you again sometime soon. yeah, like I said, on behalf of us, I hope everyone got some solid takeaways to take back to their practices, and we appreciate it. So thank you again. We loved it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, and have a good day,
Thanks for
everyone.
listening.